There's a quiet tension building across Britain right now, not the kind that explodes suddenly into headlines overnight, something slower than that, more subtle. You can almost feel it sitting underneath ordinary conversations, in kitchens, in pharmacies, in waiting rooms, in those private moments where people begin thinking about the future and realize they no longer feel entirely certain about it. And I think what's interesting is that the June 2026 PIP changes are becoming about far more than welfare policy, because for thousands of people, this isn't simply another government reform announcement. It feels personal, emotional, existential, even another reassessment, another letter through the door, another moment where someone may have to sit in front of a stranger and explain why daily life has become difficult. And honestly, that process affects people more deeply than politics often acknowledges. The government says the changes are about sustainability, about making the welfare system financially manageable long-term. Ministers argue the number of disability claims has increased significantly in recent years and that assessments need to become more targeted and more consistent. Supporters of reform say taxpayers need confidence in the system. They argue support should go to those most in need while encouraging independence and employment where possible, and in isolation. Those arguments don't sound unreasonable. Most people understand public spending has limits. Most people accept that assessments have to exist in some form. But this is where the emotional atmosphere around PIP changes completely, because Britain has already lived through years of controversy surrounding disability assessments. People remember the tribunal appeals, the stories of claimants describing interviews that felt cold or deeply impersonal, the fear of losing support that often arrives long before any official decision is even made. And once trust begins disappearing from a system like that, rebuilding it becomes incredibly difficult. You can almost feel that history hanging over this entire debate now. Even before the June 2026 changes fully arrive, there's this growing anxiety among many claimants that reassessments could become harsher, more frequent, more suspicious in tone. Not necessarily because ministers openly describe them that way, but because people have learned to read between the lines, and maybe that's the deeper issue here. This story isn't really just about benefits, it's about what happens when vulnerable people stop feeling secure inside the systems designed to protect them. Because there's something psychologically exhausting about repeatedly proving your suffering, especially when your condition may already be invisible or difficult to explain. A broken bone can be scanned, severe fatigue cannot, chronic pain often cannot, anxiety cannot always be measured neatly inside a form. And over time, many claimants begin learning that the assessment process itself becomes a skill. People study the wording, the criteria, the phrases that seem to matter. They learn how to describe their worst days in precise detail because they fear their ordinary explanations may not sound serious enough, and that changes people. It changes how they speak about themselves. It changes how they understand their own dignity, because eventually the process stops feeling like support and starts feeling like performance, a performance of vulnerability. And honestly, I think that's one reason emotions around PIP become so intense. Governments naturally think in systems and numbers, budgets, caseloads, economic inactivity figures. But ordinary people experience welfare emotionally, through fear, through uncertainty, through stress. There are people right now already worrying about assessments that may still be months away, not because they believe they've done something wrong, but because uncertainty itself becomes exhausting, especially if you're already unwell, especially if ordinary life already requires enormous effort. And then there's the wider backdrop Britain is living through right now, which matters more than politicians sometimes admit. Years of rising living costs, housing insecurity, pressure on the NHS, a growing feeling among many people that institutions are becoming harder to rely on. So when welfare reform enters public discussion, now it lands inside a country already emotionally stretched. And I keep coming back to this thought. Britain once built much of its national identity around the idea that vulnerability would not automatically lead to abandonment, that there would be some form of collective safety net beneath people during illness, disability, unemployment, or crisis, not luxury, not comfort necessarily, but protection. A sense that society would not simply leave you behind. And what's fascinating is that debates around PIP now seem to tap directly into public uncertainty about whether that promise still feels true anymore. Supporters of stricter assessments would argue the current system absolutely must change. They point to rising welfare spending and ask difficult questions about sustainability. They argue governments of any political party would eventually face pressure to reform disability support in some way, and there are many voters who genuinely agree with that position. That's important to acknowledge. Not everyone concerned about welfare spending is motivated by cruelty. Sometimes it comes from economic anxiety, sometimes from frustration, sometimes from a belief that fairness requires accountability, but welfare debates rarely stay calm for very long, because once disability support becomes framed primarily around suspicion, something cultural starts happening beneath the surface. The burden of proof shifts, disabled people begin feeling observed, measured, questioned, and the atmosphere changes from support toward verification. That emotional shift matters enormously, particularly for people whose conditions fluctuate. Someone may appear composed during a short assessment while privately collapsing afterward from exhaustion. Someone may manage one relatively functional day while struggling through the next week. Human beings are complicated, but systems prefer simplicity, tick boxes, categories, outcomes, fit or unfit, eligible or ineligible, and real life rarely behaves that neatly. It's strange because modern society constantly celebrates resilience while often misunderstanding what disability resilience actually looks like. People living with long-term conditions frequently become experts at masking difficulty. They minimize their pain publicly because they have to survive socially. They learn how to appear functional even when functioning carries enormous hidden cost. Then suddenly, during assessments, they're expected to reverse that instinct entirely, to expose weakness, to catalog limitations, to narrate suffering in convincing detail. That emotional contradiction sits at the center of this entire issue, and maybe that's why the June 2026 changes are creating such strong reactions. Before they've even fully arrived, people are not only reacting to policy, they're reacting to memory, to stories they've heard from friends and relatives, to accumulated distrust, 2 years of feeling that vulnerability increasingly comes attached to bureaucracy. There's also something broader happening politically, because the conversation around welfare is becoming tied to a larger national mood, a feeling that stability itself is slowly disappearing. Younger generations in particular have grown up through financial crashes, austerity politics, housing insecurity, pandemic disruption, and relentless cost of living pressure. Many already feel institutions are less dependable than previous generations once assumed. So when they hear discussions about tighter disability assessments or stricter welfare rules, it reinforces a deeper fear. That support itself is becoming conditional, temporary, negotiable, and maybe that explains why discussions around PIP resonate far beyond the people directly claiming it, because illness eventually touches almost everyone. Bodies age, mental health changes, accidents happen, lives shift unexpectedly. The line between independence and vulnerability is often far thinner than societies like to imagine, and perhaps that's what gives this issue its emotional weight. It quietly forces people to confront how fragile ordinary life can become. At the same time, there are genuine concerns within government circles about long-term welfare costs. Officials worry current spending trajectories may become economically unsustainable over the next decade, and Britain is not alone in facing these questions. Across many Western countries, governments are wrestling with similar pressures. How do you maintain strong welfare systems while healthcare costs rise and economic growth slows? How do you encourage independence without appearing punitive? How do you balance compassion with financial credibility? Those are not simple policy questions, but what often gets lost is that people can tolerate difficult policies more easily than they can tolerate humiliation. That distinction matters a great deal. If people feel respected and treated with dignity, trust can survive difficult reforms, but once people feel disbelieved, once they feel reduced to suspicious categories rather than human beings, resentment deepens quickly, and trust, once broken, rarely fully returns. You can already sense that emotional divide widening across Britain. Not just around welfare, around institutions generally, healthcare, politics, public services. There's this growing feeling among many people that systems increasingly demand patience while offering less certainty in return. Longer waits, more conditions, more assessments, more administrative hurdles, and eventually exhaustion. Itself becomes political. People stop reacting purely through ideology and start reacting emotionally. That's often when societies begin changing shape, not necessarily through dramatic unrest, sometimes through something quieter, withdrawal, cynicism, loss of faith. And I wonder whether the PIP debate is partly revealing that deeper emotional fatigue, now spreading through public life. Because beneath all the policy arguments, many people seem to be asking a simpler question: will the system still protect me if my life falls apart? And the answer no longer feels obvious to everyone. That uncertainty changes how people view the future. It changes how safe a society feels psychologically. And maybe that's why these reforms are provoking such powerful reactions long before June 2026 even arrives. The assessments themselves are becoming symbolic, not just of welfare policy, but of the relationship between citizens and the state, whether vulnerability is treated with empathy or suspicion, whether efficiency outweighs humanity, whether economic pressure gradually erodes collective compassion. Those are enormous cultural questions hiding underneath what initially sounds like technical administrative reform. And honestly, I don't think Britain has fully confronted them yet, because this story is still unfolding. The policies will evolve, public reactions will evolve, some fears may prove exaggerated, some concerns may prove entirely justified, but the emotional atmosphere surrounding these changes already tells us something important. People are tired of instability, tired of proving themselves, tired of systems that often feel difficult to navigate even when functioning correctly. And perhaps the real political challenge over the next few years won't simply be redesigning assessments or balancing budgets. It will be rebuilding trust, because once citizens begin approaching institutions with fear instead of confidence, societies slowly start becoming colder. Maybe that sounds dramatic, but you can already feel hints of it in quiet conversations happening across the country. Parents worrying about disabled children reaching adulthood, claimants fearing another reassessment letter, workers wondering whether support systems will still exist decades from now. Those fears rarely appear loudly, often they emerge softly. In exhausted conversations late at night, in online forums, in moments of private panic people rarely discuss publicly. And I think that's why this issue matters beyond politics, because welfare systems reveal something intimate about national values, not perfection, not limitless generosity, but priorities. Who receives patience? Who receives suspicion? Who is allowed dignity even when economically inconvenient? And maybe the conversation Britain is now beginning to have around PIP is really a conversation about that deeper moral tension, about whether modern politics still has the emotional capacity to care for vulnerability without turning it into a bureaucratic battle. I keep coming back to that thought, because behind every statistic in this debate is usually someone trying very hard to maintain an ordinary life, someone quietly navigating pain, someone calculating bills, someone rehearsing answers for an assessment they already dread. And perhaps the true measure of any system is not how efficiently it processes people when times are stable, but how human it remains when people are struggling. That may ultimately be the real question hanging over June 2026, not simply whether the assessments change, but what those changes say about the kind of country Britain believes itself to be.